Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. The President has delivered his State of the Union address. On this special edition of Think Tank, we'll talk with one of America's truly eminent social scientists about how he sees the state of our union. James Q. Wilson on crime, welfare, the family, and America. This week on Think Tank. Joining us today is James Q. Wilson, Professor of Management and Public Policy at the University of California, Los Angeles. He is the author of many books, including Crime and Human Nature, On Character, and The Moral Sense. Professor Wilson is a former president of the American Political Science Association and a recipient of its James Madison Award. Welcome to Think Tank.
Thank you.
Professor Wilson. I have been reading some of your recent work, particularly some articles, and it seems to me that what you are doing is trying to sort of present a unified field theory, the Wilson unified field theory, relating social sciences to moral philosophy. I mean, your two most recent books are On Character and The Moral Sense. That is not what you normally would think of a social scientist or a political scientist writing about.
It's barely what you'd think a philosopher would be writing about today in the era of analytical philosophy.
Right.
That's essentially right. I began as a political scientist. I began studying politics on the back streets of Chicago and then politics in New York. And, I became interested, however, in the problem of forming stable human communities. Because as you look at politics and policing and crime, you realize that what we're struggling with is to rediscover or reestablish the principle by which natural communities can form and sustain themselves. And that leads to the question, what leads to communities? And it came to be my view that there is a natural, universal human nature that drives us into communities, that makes us want to be together. And that the culture we erect and the government we put in place and the laws we design are to be tested by the principle of whether they facilitate the formation and maintenance of stable human communities. The downside of this, however, is that if these communities are too local, too parochial, then they become vehicles for racism and xenophobia and exploitation and warfare. It's a fine line, and I'm not sure our culture has yet learned how to walk that fine line.
Is this the ancient tension between freedom and discipline? Is that what we're talking about? I mean, I know you've written that modernism is terrific for most people, but it also leads into some chaos which people resent deeply.
It is the ancient tension you find in Henry Adams' writings. You find it in the writings of almost anyone who is trying to reconcile community and order on the one hand with personal freedom and progress and skeptical reason on the other hand. This civilization of which we are a part now, 2,000 or 3,000 years old, was begun by communities that felt that order and cohesion and tradition ought to dominate. And that's still the case in many parts of the world. But beginning in the 1800s, a small number of thinkers in Edinburgh and Glasgow and Paris and London began asserting the power of the individual mind, to understand the individual's own place in the world, and to assert that individual reason, unaided by revealed religion or ancient tradition, could establish a new order. And that new order came into being. We call it capitalism, democracy, freedom, science, technology.
And it is an intoxicating brew, isn't it?
It is
I
an
mean,
intoxicating
it's
brew.
sweeping the world. I mean, this is American popular culture, and all that kind of stuff is knocking over all the pins.
Almost all of the pins, but it's coming up against a barrier. The great dividing line, I think, around the globe today is the dividing line that goes as follows. On one side are the children of the Enlightenment, those who believe in reason, individualism, and personal freedom. On the other side of the dividing line is the world of Islam and Confucianism, the world that believes that man's reason cannot grasp his own estate, that tradition, authority, religion embedded in the state ought to govern mankind. And they're betting that we're wrong, and they're pointing to crime, drug abuse, and family dissolution as evidence that they're wrong that we're wrong and they're right.
On the theory that neither of us practice Islam or Confucianism, so we too, and the vast majority of our audience would be children of the Enlightenment.
Yes.
Okay, now within that rubric of children of the Enlightenment, there's a split. Some people saying, great, individualism, freedom, do your own thing. And then there are people like yourself who are saying we somehow have to put discipline back in the Enlightenment equation.
Yes. I think that the tension we find within ourselves is a tension that began at the turn of the century, that accelerated in the 1920s after the First World War, and that came to full flowering in the 1960s. And it is the tension between that part of our society that gives people an enhanced grip on and a enhanced devotion to either individual reason or personal self-assertion, and leaves behind as assumed moral capital those institutions, family, village, church, that permits people to exercise those freedoms responsibly. And the tension we now face, I think, is between those who believe that that moral capital need not be assumed, in fact that it's a burden, it's bourgeois, Philistine life, and ought to be ignored, and those people who believe not only that the moral capital ought to be assumed to exist, but that it must be replenished, and that we have failed to replenish that stock.
Is that a good definition of the split in American political life between liberals and conservatives?
I think it's a fundamental split in our life, and I'm not sure whether the words liberal or conservative belong to it. I mean, where is a libertarian in this definition? Libertarian is on many economic grounds quite conservative, but on matters of self-expression, personal freedom, extremely liberal. But it is the fundamental cleavage. It's the cleavage between orthodoxy and heterodoxy. It's the cleavage between emancipation and religion. It's the cleavage that drives the social issues of our day.
Let me go to some specifics now. I want to talk, I guess, mostly about welfare and crime. You recently did an article in the City Journal for the Manhattan Institute about welfare reform and character development, and you said there are three potential solutions: structural, rational, and cultural. And then you said there are three precepts by which we can attack each or any of those problems. Could you sort of lay out that thesis now that we've sort of discovered your purchase on things in general?
I think welfare reform is a good test of what divides us. The Enlightenment view is either jobs have moved out of the city and therefore people can't work and hence they're on welfare. That's the structuralist view. Or they argue that we have given the wrong incentives to poor people by rewarding them for having illegitimate children, rewarding them for not working, rewarding them for not getting married. That's also the Enlightenment view. But the other view, the view for which I don't have an adequate name yet, is saying those things probably contribute to some degree, but what has fundamentally changed is the idea that marriage is a sacrament, a commitment, that it is essential, that two parents are almost invariably better than one, and that allowing culturally or economically single-parent households to grow up is a disaster. Now, my view is much more on the cultural side, although I recognize the force of the other two arguments. And the reason it is because worldwide this is happening. No matter what kind of welfare system you put in place, no matter what kind of payments you make, no matter how you organize the economy in the West, single-parent households are becoming the norm.
Yeah, but you and I have had this discussion before. I mean, let us stipulate, I think most people in the world would agree, Dan Quayle was right, a single-parent family, a lack of a father in the house is a dreadful way to bring up a child, all, with some exceptions. We are encouraging that. We are buying illegitimate babies in this country. You know that. I mean, the welfare package for a young woman who has an out-of-wedlock child, if you count in all the benefits, is estimated somewhere between $16,000 and $20,000.
Yes, of course it contributes.
So isn't that the same issue? I mean, and if you go after the governmental side, look, government caused it, government ought to be able to cure it. That's a discrete target, and you have a political ferment in this country. If you go the other way, you are, and I'd have no objection, what you're saying is the churches ought to be better, more people ought to go to the YMCA, which is fine, but what's the action point? What's the touch point to
You see,
do something?
You, Ben, think of this as a public policy problem, and I
Right.
don't think of it as a public policy problem. You assume that if we have a problem in society, that government has a purchase on it.
Government caused some of these
Government
problems.
caused it, but government can't correct everything it causes. Glenn Larry has a good example. If you pull on a string that's part of a sweater, you can unravel the sweater, but you can't put the sweater back together by pushing on the string. The existence of a welfare program facilitated the growth of the single-parent family underclass. Even though government programs of a very different nature abroad have also produced the same effect. Abroad, they don't reward people for having illegitimate children. Abroad, they have children's allowances. You can get money from the government whether you're married or unmarried.
Well, that rewards an unmarried mother with a child if she gets her children's allowance, even if she's not married. Isn't the whole panoply of social welfare states doing that?
No, they're all doing it differently.
But with the same premise, out-of-wedlock children are not stigmatized.
That's the key. Out-of-wedlock children are not stigmatized. And that's the cultural component. I agree with you that the government ought to reconsider its welfare policy here and abroad. I agree with you that there ought to be probably a cap on benefits. I agree with you that if we can somehow, by modifying that policy, remove what makes it so easy for this single-parent family underclass to sustain itself, that is worth doing. But I'm adding, in addition, the argument that even if we remove it, it won't undo the damage. It takes 10 years to destroy a weak family by perverse incentives. It's going to take 2 or 3 generations to put it back together again. And the putting back together doesn't automatically follow from changing the incentives.
It seems to me that this welfare argument, when you get right down to the short strokes on it, it is between people who are saying we have to save this generation and people who are saying we have to save the next generation. There's not a whole lot you can do about this generation. We'll do the best we can. We'll do sort of Clinton light or Clinton heavy and, try to get them into work and whatever. But as you have written so eloquently, those programs have not worked very well. And then those of us who are saying, look, concentrate on the next generation, cut all those rewards and benefits, make it prospective and say a year after the passage of a new welfare bill, we are not going to give cash benefits to out-of-wedlock births. Mm-hmm. You buy that?
I would be willing to see that tried. My view is that we are both making bets on the future, and neither one of us, indeed no one, really knows how to make a bet on the future. But we have 50 states, and I want to see a welfare law that encourages some states to do exactly what you said, and other states to do something quite different. Perhaps leave the welfare check intact, but have the check go not to the young woman, but to go to an entity, a family home, the Florence Crittenden Center, the Salvation Army, the St. Martin de Porres home in Chicago, where if she wants the benefits of the check, she and her child have to go and live under truly adult supervision. And then let's find out, 3, 5, 10 years from now, which combination of strategies is making the greatest progress. I don't want to make a bet on the future of young children based simply on what we now know or what lessons we think we can extract from history.
Let's talk about crime. How does this same unified field theory of morality mixed with social science, you have, I guess, started out as I was going to say a criminal social scientist, as a social scientist who studies criminality. Is there a similar sort of a pattern?
I think so. In every culture, the vast majority of people obey the law with relatively little governmental constraint. In every culture, a small fraction, mostly young males, don't obey the law without a lot of constraint. Those are the uniformities of human nature. The 6% of any group of 18-year-old boys in London, Copenhagen, Stockholm, Philadelphia, Racine, Wisconsin, Orange County, California, get in trouble with the law. What's different across countries is the cultural and legal context in which that happens. If the cultural and legal context weakens, then the 6% will not simply commit some crimes, they will commit a horrendous number of crimes. So the problem, therefore, is can we address what is going on in the lives of the 6% at the same time that we tighten the cultural constraints and the legal constraints around them. Now, in this country, we have only a few techniques we can use to tighten the constraints around them. The best we can do is make credible threats of punishment. This country, for 20 years, reduced the credibility of any serious threat of punishment from 1960 to at least 1980. The probability of going to prison was going down for most crimes.
So you are a distinguished social scientist, a student of criminology, and what you are saying is what the man on the street was saying 25 years ago, is this country is getting soft on crime.
Of course they were right.
Do most of your colleagues agree with that?
No. Many of my colleagues think that the United States imprisons people, that we make use of prison too frequently, and that we put the wrong people in prison. I believe they're wrong. It's a lively and spirited debate. But I also believe that prison alone isn't a sufficient answer, because if our real problem is 14-year-olds armed with 9mm weapons who are going around shooting randomly in their neighborhood and killing 2-year-old babies, it's a long time before the adult criminal justice system will catch up with them. And by the time it does catch up with them, there'll be a lot of bodies on the street. So then the question is, how can we address the way in which that 6% grows up? And it seems to me that's the linkage with the welfare reform debate. One of the reasons I don't want to rely simply on changing economic incentives is that I want to capture what we can of that newborn generation of children. We now have $19 billion spent on welfare. It goes to mothers. If the money, or a large fraction of it, went to places in which the mother and child lived, and the mother was taught how to raise that child, so that that child would not grow up, if he's a boy, thinking that male predatory sexuality, impregnating as many women as possible, escaping the burdens of fatherhood, never looking for a job unless a job is handed to you, using drugs at the first opportunity. If all of those things were not part of the equation, because the environment now was rewarding different attitudes, we might be able to change the causal factors that are driving part of the crime rate.
So you are saying that intelligent welfare is a cure to crime?
I think that the welfare reform debate and the crime control debate are one and the same debate and ought to be linked. Not because all welfare recipients are criminals. That's not true. But the overwhelming majority of people in prison have grown up in single-parent households.
So when the Democrats say we need prevention programs and the Republicans say that's pork, under those broad rubrics, you would be a liberal. You would come out, you are in favor of prevention programs. Now, you may not like midnight basketball, but is that right?
I'm in favor of prevention programs if they're based on what we know, scientifically know about prevention programs. And that is that you cannot start young enough. You must deal with very young children who are living in at-risk neighborhoods. You can't have a prevention program aimed at 15-year-olds. We have no evidence that any of those programs make a difference. You can't have prevention programs that try to rehabilitate offenders. With trivial exceptions, we have virtually no evidence that they work. Where we do have evidence is that the at-risk children begin to display antisocial behavior by the time they're 6 or 7 years old. And it's the result of having grown up in a family with an abusive parent, an alcoholic parent, a criminal parent, a parent who practices cold, inconsistent, or indifferent discipline. That's where the intervention has to take place. Now, will these programs work? The only few cases we have, and they're small, they're experimental, they're hard to generalize, suggest that those programs do make a difference, and the difference lasts for 20 years.
Jim, doesn't that lead you inexorably to the O word, which has come to be the orphanage word? Isn't that in effect, I mean, if were I a liberal, heaven forfend, and I heard that, I'd say, oh, this is a guy who believes in orphanages.
And that's a measure
just like Newt Gingrich.
That's a measure of soundbite journalism and soundbite policy analysis, which is what passes for deep thinking in Washington, D.C. Orphanages are institutions designed to house children who have been abandoned by their parents or who both parents are dead. We always have had orphanages. The problem is not children that have been abandoned by their parents or who both parents are dead. The problem is children being raised by a teenage mother who doesn't know how to raise them. Now, if that mother and the child go into an institution, it's not an orphanage, it's a family shelter. We've had such shelters in this country for decades. We've usually called them maternity homes. You go in there just before the child is due, you learn how to take care of the newborn child, you stay there for perhaps a year after it's born, you learn how to take care of the newborn. The difficulty is that these homes are very small.
And then send them back into a neighborhood where 8-year-olds are running around with guns.
Exactly. So
that's not a great idea.
So therefore, can we expand the idea of a family shelter so that it lasts longer? Can we then convert, as the child grows older, into a boarding school, where the child goes to school on a residential basis, sees its mother as often as it wants, the father if it has one, but the father and the mother, or typically the mother, doesn't live there. I think we've had experience in this country in running all of these institutions for 100 years. We've forgotten that experience, and as a result, when somebody reminds us of this experience, we reach for our gun and fire the orphanage bullet at each other.
Let us wrap this up now. Let me ask you one other question. How a final sort of wrap up, 2 parts. First, is there a name for this Wilson unified field theory that we're talking about? And secondly, how should we go about strengthening the moral sense? Your title of your book.
What I would like to call my view of human nature is common sense. I mean that in a literal way. It comes from the common sense philosophers of the 18th century in England and Scotland. It is the philosophy that begins with the proposition that human nature is everywhere essentially the same, that parents love their children, that children want to conform to the expectations of their parents, and this is only possible if there are supportive communities and cultures around them that reward responsible child rearing and hold people individually accountable for their actions. I think the vast majority of people all over the globe, whether they've read a single book or not, subscribe to this. The difficulty is we are now forcing them in this country and other countries to raise these children against a new kind of culture, a culture that is the product of a form of hyper-educationalism, the kind of exaggerated enlightenment that says essentially bourgeois society is suspect or Philistine, it is not modern, it is not emancipated, it is not advanced. The culture ought to emancipate the individual. And that tension between common sense and familism and the emancipation of the individual is the bane struggle of the last 200 years. I think both ought to be in the right balance, but I think the balance has been tipped in favor of do your own thing. When children of rich parents do their own thing, the result usually is some degree of chaos for which dad can afford to pay the bills. When the children of poor families do their own thing, no one is there to pick up the pieces, to put their lives back together, or to pay the bills. What children today in poor neighborhoods in some cases are doing is what they have learned from watching spoiled rich kids behave on television sitcoms, in rock musicals, and listening to the language they hear among the intellectual elite.
James Q. Wilson, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben.
And thank you. We enjoy hearing from our audience. Please continue to send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036, or we can be reached via email at thinktv@aol.com. We receive a lot of comments about the show, whether it's email, snail mail, or from other sources.
We're informed that PBS is too liberal, too radical, too un-American, too elitist, too left-wing. Or do those critics include among left-wing elitists the conservative Ben Wattenberg, whose weekly panels present a wide spectrum of challenging intellects, right and left, in a balanced discussion in understandable terms or some of the most arcane issues of our day?
For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.